Heyo, welcome to another fundamentals video. I'm going to try to keep it as close to 15 minutes as I can, as the title suggests, but this one's long and it's complicated and there's a lot of nuances, so I want to provide a lot of examples. I'd rather you guys understand it than me actually making the 15-minute title. But anyways, today is going to be on building chains, and there's a lot of complex stuff that comes in, you know, when multiple players have multiple things going on the chain, and when you want to kind of interact with your opponent, when are you allowed to do that, and all that kind of thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and get on into it. It's kind of gonna be like a lecture almost, so hopefully that's cool with you. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump on in because we have a lot to cover. And why is this topic important for you to know about? Well, basically, building chains is one of the fundamental pieces of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just interacting with your opponent back and forth, deciding which chain links are in which order. You have to know what is legally allowed to do per the rules. And you know, along the same lines, you don't want to be cheating your opponent by putting stuff out of order of what it should be or what it could be. And the same for you. You don't want your opponent to be cheating you. So it's important to know what is actually going on behind the scenes. And then a third thing is that this is like the foundation, the building blocks for understanding a little bit more complex topics such as chain blocking, which is going to be in the next video. So that's just a few reasons why you should watch this one. In order to start this conversation, we have to talk about what kind of effects exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! And then that's going to allow us to actually learn how to build chains. So we're going to start with a type of effect called trigger effects, and you can tell your cards are trigger effects if they have this kind of text in there pretty frequently. So there's two types of trigger effects. There's mandatory ones where you don't have a choice, you have to activate them if that applies, and there's also optional ones which you can choose to do or choose not to do, and that will come up later. So for the mandatory ones, it's going to look like, in the text, it's going to look like when something happens, do this, or if something happens, do this. And here's a couple examples. We have Sangan, which says when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, search one monster. Okay, so whenever Sangan goes to the graveyard, you have to do it. You don't have a choice. Mermelio also has a mandatory effect. This one is an if effect where it says if this card is summoned, target a spell or trap your opponent controls and destroy it. Okay, so let's look at a couple optional triggers. So Elemental Hero Stratos is an example. This one says when this card is summoned, you can search a hero monster. And then we also have an if effect where we have Unchained Twins Aruha. If this card is destroyed, you can special summon another Unchained from your deck. So whether or not it says when or if is not very important for this particular video in terms of trigger effects. That will come up in a future video where we're going to talk about what missing timing means. But for this particular one, it's not a big deal to really understand the difference between when and if. Okay, so after trigger effects, we also have quick effects, okay? And quick effects also come in kind of two categories. One is a set of effects where you have an activation requirement, okay? So, for example, we have Ash Blossom and Droll. And for you to activate these, right, something has to happen. Like, you can't just Ash for fun. Like, your opponent has to activate something that would search or summon from deck or whatever, and then you can Ash. Same with Droll. Droll says, you know, if your opponent added a monster from deck to the hand except you're in the draw phase, you can discard this card and they can't do it anymore, right? So these both have activation requirements, and what we particularly want to focus on are the ones that say when X you can do. So that's like Ash Blossom, that's like Ghost Bell, that's like Baronne de Fleur, Psyframe Gear Gamma, Borreload Savage Dragon. They all say when your opponent does X, you can activate this effect, negate it, right? Okay, so we have to keep that in mind because that will come up big in the future of this video. Okay, and then we have other quick effects that don't have activation requirement. Sorry, let me get this in view here for you guys a little bit. Such as Effect Veiler and Imperm, right? They don't have any activation requirement. You can just do it whenever you want. Okay, they just have the text form, you can do whatever, like Veiler. You can discard this card, target one monster your opponent controls, negates effects to the end of the turn, right? And quick effects without activation requirement can be used anytime. Okay, so they don't have to respond directly to anything or anything like that. So all these kind of nuances are going to come up when we're learning how to build chains and what is allowed and what is not. And then just for completeness, we also have ignition effects. These are the non-quick effects. These ones are just like do something, like Dark Hole, destroy all monsters in the field. Tenyi Spirit Shithana, special summon this monster from your hand, So it's all stuff like that where nothing has to happen. It's also not a quick effect, it just happens. Ignition effects are not going to be an important part of this video. I just wanted to remind you guys what that category was, right? Okay, so now that we understand quick effects and triggers, we're going to get into building a chain link. And really, the core order of things is this. We have our mandatory triggers that we look at, we have our optional triggers that we look at, and then we have our quick effects that we look at. Okay, so in general, we're going to find all of our mandatory triggers first, then we're going to find all of our optional triggers, and then we're going to find all of the possible quick effects that we might want to add to this chain. And I'm going to give examples of a lot of this stuff, okay? But in general, not only do we have these three things, but we also have different players, right? We have the turn player, which for most of these examples, assume you're the turn player for this video, and we have the non-turn player, which we're going to assume is the opponent. And kind of in general, we're going to find that the turn player often goes first, right? When we are trying to find all of our mandatory triggers, we're going to find all the turn players' mandatory triggers, put them on the chain first, and then we're going to find all of our non-turn players' mandatory triggers and put those on the chain second. Then we're going to go back and forth. It doesn't always follow this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 order in this particular, that's shown in this particular image here, but often it does. And, there's going to be some exceptions, which we're going to get into. Okay, so now that we kind of have a baseline thought of what's going on, we're actually going to set up some rules, okay? And I'm going to present the rules to you, and then we're going to follow along in the examples, and we'll see how the rules show up, okay? So here, there's going to be 4 chain building rules. I'm just going to give you the first 2 right now, okay? So number 1, the turn player adds their trigger effects to the chain first for a given category. Okay, so for example, a category is mandatory triggers or optional triggers if they choose to do the optional ones, right? So just like this picture shows, for mandatory triggers, turn player goes first, non-turn player goes second, if there are mandatory triggers. If there's not, then let's skip to the optional triggers, okay? Optional triggers, the turn player will choose to put their optional triggers on first, then the non-turn player can choose to put their optional triggers on. Okay, so in a given row, the turn player goes first, the non-turn player goes second, in general. Okay, number 2, one player makes the last trigger effect, the other player is the first to be allowed to respond with a quick effect. Let's say we summon Elemental Hero Stratos effect to search. Okay, let's say there's no other triggers on the chain, right? If one player activates Stratos, it's the last trigger. The other player is just allowed to respond with Ash. Okay, so that's the quick effect. So whoever goes last to put a trigger on, the other player gets to try to hand trap it first, or negate it, or respond with something first. Okay, and we're going to go through a couple examples here. So let's start with just the mandatory triggers. Let's say there's just a mandatory trigger for you, and the non-turn player doesn't have any mandatory triggers, okay? So the first thing that will go on the chain is the mandatory trigger for you. The second thing will be the non-turn player would have a chance to use a quick effect, and then you would have a chance to respond to the non-turn player's quick effect. So here's an example. We link off Sengen for Summon Great Almirage, right? There's only mandatory triggers. The only trigger is Sengen to search, okay? So Sengen is going to be chain link 1. The non-turn player could do something like Ash, okay? That would be chain link 2, because whoever the last person to put a trigger on the chain was, which is you, the other player gets to use a quick effect first, and that's your opponent. So they have the first chance at Ash, right? And then we can respond with like cross out or call by or something if we have something, or any other quick effect that doesn't have any kind of timing requirement, right? So we can just go from Sengen to Ash to cross out, and that's it for the chain. Now what happens if both players have mandatory triggers here, okay? If we both have mandatory triggers, then the turn player's mandatory triggers go first, the non-turn player's mandatory triggers go second, and then now the turn player gets to respond to quick effects first, because like we said in those rules, in rule number 2, one player makes the last trigger effect, the other player is the first to be allowed to respond with a quick effect. So in the case where the non-turn player also has a mandatory trigger, now the turn player again has chainlink 3 priority here to activate a quick effect to respond to it. Okay, so here's an example. let's say both players control a Sengen and I super poly. Both Sengens away for a starting Venom Fusion Dragon, right? The turn player's Sengen, my Sengen, goes first on the chain, number 1. Non-turn player's Sengen goes number 2. Now I can respond with Ash if I want, okay? And then the non-turn player can respond with cross out or whatever. Now the non-turn player cannot respond with Ash as well and try to Ash my Sengen, right? The Ash has to respond directly to whatever the previous chain link was. So the only thing the non-turn player can respond with that has a when X you can do something is something that would respond to Ash Blossom's activation, because that was the most recent chain link, or something that doesn't have any timing requirement, like cross out or called by. You know, you can cross out or call by anytime. It doesn't have to be on a chain or directly in response to Ash in theory, right? So this is how the chain would be. Okay, cool. Now let's get into the third and fourth rules, because they're a little bit more complicated, and we're going to keep doing examples for all these. Don't worry. Number 3, if a player has multiple trigger effects of the same type, like mandatory or optional, they can choose the order that they go on the chain. Okay, so in our previous examples, there was only one trigger per player, right? Sengen for me, Sengen for opponent. What if there's multiple triggers of the same? Like, what if I had 3 mandatory triggers? What order would they go in? You get to pick. Okay, that's very important, and that's very important for a concept called chain blocking, which we will have a whole nother video on. Okay, but the important thing to know is you pick the order if they're all optional, or if they're all mandatory. You pick the order. Okay, and then number 4. This one's where it gets a little bit complex, okay, where we break the chain of just going back and forth till we're done. A player can choose to skip their optional triggers and respond with quick effects instead. This one's a little tough to think about, but we're going to get into examples in a second, okay? So let's look at this example. I have an optional trigger, but my opponent has a mandatory trigger. So we're going to fill out all these boxes, basically. And our example is going to be I super poly 2 Sengens and a Shadell Falco for this Predaplant fusion that requires 3 darts in the field, okay? So I have 1 Sengen, and I have a Falco, and my opponent has a Sengen. What are the chain links here? Well, first is going to be my Sengen, right? Second is going to be my opponent's Sengen, because those are both mandatory, okay? They have to go, we have to do the mandatory ones first. And then my Falco, right? Falco is an optional effect. If it goes to the graveyard, we can special summon it back to the field, okay? So here's our chain link. So Sengen 1, Sengen 2, Falco 3, and now if there's like a Ghost Bell, we can respond, the opponent can respond to that Falco with a Ghost Bell, because that's the most recent thing that happened in the chain. They can't respond to the Sengen. I can't respond to their Sengen because that's we've assembled too many things on the chain in between, so we can only respond with hand traps to the most recent effect, right? So or with like when activation requirement hand traps like Ash, Bell, Gamma, you know, Barone, stuff like that. We can only respond to the most recent things. So the only thing that can be hand trapped here is the Falco, because it's chainlink 3 and there's no more triggers, right? But what if I really want to Ash? What if I really want to Ash my opponent's Sengen? I do not want them to search. Like, I don't really care if my Falco comes back, but I would rather Ash their Sengen. What that means is I can bypass my my optional trigger. I can like choose, hey, I'm not activating that Falco. I'm going to Ash the Sengen instead, right? And that's what rule number 4 basically says. Let's go back to the rules. A player can choose to skip their optional triggers and respond with quick effects instead. Okay, so here I can choose to skip my optional trigger of Falco and respond with Ash instead, because this is the only chance I have to Ash that Sengen is if I respond directly to the Sengen, okay? So this is kind of, that's rule number 4. Like, those are the 4 basic like rules for building big chain links, okay? Now, what if my opponent had the Falco, right? What if I had 1 Sengen and my opponent had 1 Sengen and 1 Falco, and I super polyed all 3? Can I still Ash their Sengen? No, because my Sengen's chainlink 1, their Sengen's chainlink 2. Then they can, I don't have any optional triggers, okay? So I don't get a chance to activate anything. They have, they still have an optional trigger to put on the chain, right? So they have a Falco. So Falco's chainlink 3. Now I can't Ash the Sengen anymore, because the last chain on the chain link is Falco now, right? And remember, with the hand traps like that, or like Barone or whatever, when it says when X happens, you can negate it. you can only respond to the most recent one. Okay, so I can't Ash the Sangan anymore because the most recent one is the Falco, but I can still Bell the Falco if I want. Okay, so that's kind of how it works. All right, now to cover rule number 3, let's go back up here. If a player has multiple trigger effects of the same type, mandatory, optional, they can choose the order that they go on the chain. So now let's look at this example. I fuse Falco and Rashidal Wendy for an app clone, okay, with, let's say, polymerization. Okay, now there's no other triggers. My opponent doesn't have hand traps, whatever. Now I have multiple optional triggers, right? When Falco goes to grave, he summons himself back. When Wendy goes to grave, she can summon a Shoutout from your deck face down. And when App Clone gets summoned, I can target a card on the field and negate its effects, right? Those are all optional. So now what happens? I have 3 cards going into box 3. What's going on? That means I can put them in any order I want. I can go Falco Chainlink 1, Wendy Chainlink 2, App Clone Chainlink 3, or, you know, App Clone Chainlink 1, Falco 2, Wendy 3, or whatever order fits me best. And now if you kind of like have knowledge of this already and you know the concept of chain blocking, this is where chain blocking is going to come in. I'm not going to get into that in this video. That's going to be the next one actually. So just like keep this in mind, that the order in which you put your optional triggers on the chain matters, because like we said, remember, like Ash can only respond to the most recent chain link, right? Or Bell or Barone. It can only respond to the most recent chain link. So that means probably whatever the final chain link you put on is going to be vulnerable to hand traps. So you just have to be aware of that. And this is where like the concept of chain blocking is, okay? All right, let's do some complicated ones. Let's do some complicated ass chain building. Okay, so here's our situation. I activate Foolish Burial. I send Kelbeck. You know, this is a great example for building big chains back when in a tier limit format, Ishizu tier, when we had some big chain situations going on. Okay, so I Foolish Kelbeck, and now I mill Ash, Trivi Karma, Scream, Sulik, Sharon. Okay? My opponent mills Trivi Karma, Imperm Ash, Eclipse Wyvern, Bestial Saronir. Okay? Why'd I put Bestial Wyvern in this? Why'd I put Eclipse Wyvern in this? Well, it's a mandatory effect. So I wanted to have that in my example. Okay, so if you don't know Eclipse Wyvern's effect, go check it out really quick. But let's move on. How are we going to build this chain? Okay, so here I showed you the cards that were milled, and this is kind of the generic like template for building a chain. It's not necessarily the only template, but it's a generic one. Okay, let's look at the mandatory triggers first. Do I have any mandatory triggers? I am the tier limit player over here on the left. Do I have any mandatory triggers? No. Okay, does my opponent have mandatory triggers? Yes. Eclipse Wyvern. Okay, so Eclipse Wyvern must be Chainlink 1 on this chain. Now, next, do I have any optional triggers? Yes. 3 of them. I have Tier Scream, Tier Sulik, and Tier Sharon, right? What order do they go in? If you remember the rule, we get to pick. If they're all in the same box, we pick the order, okay? So in this case, let's say I go Scream 2, Sulik 3, Sharon 4. Great, okay? Now, that's all of my trigger effects. Does my opponent have any trigger effects? They have a chance to put them on the chain. Yeah, they got Saronir. Saronir effect to Foolish, a branded card, or a Bestial card, right? Cool. Now we move on to quick effects. Who gets to activate quick effects first? I do, because my opponent put Saronir on the chain, right? So if my opponent was the last one to put a trigger effect on the chain, I have the first quick effect action, okay? What quick effects do I have? Unless I have some kind of hand trap in my hand, nothing, except for Trivi Karma. I can banish this Trivi Karma to search right now if I want. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And then Chainlink 6, that's the only trigger effect I have. Chainlink 6, what does my opponent have? Let's assume they have no hand traps. They have Trivi Karma also. So they can chuck that on as Chainlink 7, right? And now we resolve the chain. It resolves backwards. My opponent searches with Trivi Karma. I search with Trivi Karma. My opponent foolishes with Saronir. I fuse with Sharon, search with Sulik, search with Scream, and then my opponent banishes with Eclipse Wyvern. Not so bad, right? Once you know the rules of, you know, finding the mandatory ones, finding the optional ones, and finding the quick effects, it's pretty easy to build. All right, now let's have a little deviation here. What if my opponent has a Ghost Spell in hand, right? And we've gotten to this point where we have Eclipse Wyvern on the chain. It's mandatory, it has to go on the chain. And then I order my, I'm gonna put my chain links, chain 2, Scream, chain 3, Solid, chain 4, Sharon. My opponent has a Bell. right? And they're like, hey, like, do I really want this Sarnier Foolish, or do I want to stop this Shiren from fusing? So what my opponent can do, if we remember, my opponent can bypass their optional triggers to activate a quick effect instead, right? Remember that was the rule number 4. They can skip their Sarnier here and Bell instead, okay? But if they Bell, that means they can't Sarnier anymore, okay? Their chance to activate Sarnier is gone. They can't go Bell 5, Sarnier 6. Like, they've passed the opportunity, right? So you have to pick one or the other when in this situation. And then after that, yeah, we can do the Trivia Karma stuff. And this would be the new chain link, right? So then we would resolve, Trivia Karmas would search, Bell would negate the Shiren, Scream and Sulk search, and Eclipse Wyvern to banish, okay? So, like, this was a fairly complex chain link. Like, this was the biggest, like, challenge of, like, a year ago. Yu-Gi-Oh was figuring out a Shizu tier chain links, but when you break it down like this, it's really not so bad, okay? Let's do a couple more complex ones. So, let's see, can we see this? My opponent activates Danger Mothman, and I snipe it out of his hand, right? His or her hand, and it goes to the graveyard. So they use effect. All right, we're both going to draw one and discard one. That's what Mothman does. This is my hand here. I have Ash, Droll, Bell, Fenrir, Tier Cash. Okay, cool. Both players draw and discard a Dark World Brow. Let's read Dark World Brow. If this card is discarded from the hand to the graveyard by card effect, draw one card, right? That's a mandatory effect. It's not you can draw one card, it's draw one card. So what can the possible chain link be? Well, my opponent would have their Brow first, right? Because they're the turn player. In this example, my opponent's the turn player. Their Brow's first, my Brow's second. We have no choice. Those are mandatory effects. Chain link 3, quick effects for my opponent. Let's say my opponent doesn't have any quick effects, right? So can I Ash my opponent's Brow? No, right? Because the most recent trigger effect on the chain link was my own Brow. So if I discarded Ash and used effect, I would actually be ashing myself, right? So what do we have here that can activate? Well, we can still activate Droll. Okay, Droll is not a when X you can discard it and do stuff. Droll is an if X you can discard it and do stuff, and we're still able to Droll the Danger Mothman. And then we would resolve the chain, we would Droll, and then neither player would be able to draw here, right? Because Droll stops both players from drawing, and Droll would resolve first, okay? Cool. New example, scenario 2. Let's say I draw an Ash Blossom, another Ash Blossom. Let's see, can you guys see this? Yeah, I draw another Ash Blossom and discard my tier limit Kashtira in my hand, right? And then my opponent draws something and discards the A tier Shiren. What are the examples here? All right. Does anyone have mandatory triggers? Is tier Cash or Shiren mandatory? No. Okay. Optional triggers. My opponent, yes, they have Shiren. So they're going to activate Shiren to fuse. Probably going to fuse their Shiren and Mothman for a Mud Dragon. Okay. Now it's to me. Now I have two options here, right? Option 1 is to activate that tier Cash to mill 2. Or my option is to skip my optional trigger and Ghost Bell that Shiren. Okay? So I have to pick tier Cash or Bell. And then no matter which of those I pick, I'll still be able to activate Droll after. Droll, because they drew with Mothman. Now I can Droll them, right? So that's how it works. We have two options. We have to pick either our optional trigger or our quick effect in response to their optional trigger. We can't do both, okay? But we can still do the quick effect Droll to respond to their Mothman draw, okay? So not so bad. Okay, once you kind of break it down a little bit into these boxes, it's not so bad. So let me know if you guys have comments. Hopefully that was clear to you guys. And if you have questions, leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to answer any legit questions you guys have. If you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe to the channel. Helps me out a ton, and there's more coming. I have chain blocking, missing timing, battle phase and draw step. Battle phase and damage step, like end phase, effect resolution, a whole bunch of ideas for this type of video. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments, and let me know if there's any other topics that you want to see, and I can kind of do kind of educational content like that, because hopefully it helps. I probably went way over 15 minutes, but whatever. I'd rather you guys learn than me meeting the the video title. All right, so I'll catch you guys in the next one. We'll see you guys later. Enjoy. We'll see you.